Welcome to the Connected Enterprise Podcast. This is Carl Lewis, your host from Vision33. My guest today is Deb Muller from HR Acuity. Deb, welcome to the podcast. We always start out by asking our guests to tell us a little bit about themselves and a little bit about the company that you are the CEO of, please.
Great. Thanks, Carl. I really am excited to be here. So as you said, I'm Deb Muller. I'm the CEO and founder of HR Acuity. I started my career out not thinking I was going to be a CEO of a tech company, I'll tell you that. But I spent a couple decades in HR, human resources, in a variety of leadership areas, a variety of HR functional areas, decided to go out on my own in early 2000s to conduct investigations. It was something I had done a lot, investigations into harassment, discrimination. That was sort of where I was going with my company. Started HR Acuity in 2006, and then realized what I think I probably already knew, that there needed to be a better way to do investigations. There needed to be a better way to manage those moments in organizations when things go wrong. And that there wasn't a way. It was done sort of haphazardly based upon people's experience. And I knew that technology could help with that. So with no technology experience, I decided I would be the one to solve that problem. Jumped in, and HR Acuity pivoted to become what is now the only human resource SaaS solution specifically designed for employee relations, case management, and investigations. And here's
very interesting. I would have never thought of that, but you certainly did, and I'm sure that it's extremely helpful when those, like you said, when things go wrong. So today, one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was a little bit about what's going on in our country as it relates to unions. And you have a little bit of knowledge about this, and so I really would love to get some of your feelings and evaluation of it. It seems like to me that unions have been kind of have a growing interest in 2022 in particular, maybe 2021 as well. What do you think are some factors that have kind of caused this bit of a resurgence in the activity of new unions forming?
Yeah, let me preface this by saying I am not a union expert. In my history in HR, I led organizations that had collective bargaining units. So we had unions that we were working alongside of. But I think it just sort of is symbolic of sort of a different problem that going on, as you said, what's going on in the in the world. In the past few years, really the work environment, the environment for everybody has changed, right? There's been this sort of external social unrest that's been going on with, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course the pandemic just turned the world up on its head a few years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, in ways that none of us could have ever imagined in our lifetimes. And so that has absolutely influenced this growth. We hear it, not only do we see it, we hear it when we talk to other employee relations leaders, we get them together all the time of how this is showing itself in their work environments. So it's really led to this time of employee activism, right? A different type of expectation of employees of their employers, this expectation of transparency, which, I believe comes from sort of a lack of trust. But employees want to know more about what's going on and how decisions are being made by their employers. They're no longer just sitting by idly. They believe it's much more of sort of a 50-50 relationship. So I think that's part of it. Generational changes, different generation coming to the workforce and their expectations. And we also have access to things like the internet. I mean, information, it's been here a while, but it's absolutely changed how people access information, how they share information, how they talk to other people about what's happening, what's not happening in the workforce.
You mentioned the pandemic. Can you think of some sort of tangible ways that the pandemic kind of plays a part in this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we think about the pandemic, particularly our essential workers, those workers, they were there for us, for their employer. They went out when other people were staying in. They were on the front line, and for a while we cheered them and we clanged we clapped for them and everything. And so I think after that has sort of come back, the question is from these workers, well, what are you going to do for us? What are you going to do for us now that we've sort of gone on a limb and we were there when you needed us? And do we still feel safe now in this environment? We see example after example of customers having real bad behaviors. How are you protecting me, the employee? And I think many organizations are saying, like, the customer used to always be right. Maybe not, the customer's not always right now, but is that true in your work environment? We're seeing much more violence, gun violence in workplaces. What are you doing to protect me as that frontline worker, to feel safe if I'm in a retail setting or where I'm running with the customer, the consumer? During the pandemic, we learned about time off and when do you need time off? If you're sick, do you get to work time off? What if you have to care for somebody else that's sick? So all of these things sort of came to the forefront in a big way before anybody was ready for it. I think many organizations responded appropriately at the time, but now that that's come back, employees are asking, how is this all going to work now? Work from home, another great example, right? Everybody worked from home. We didn't have a choice. And now, well, why can't I keep working from home? I'm doing the same job. So it just sort of propelled a lot of questions and different ways of working in a different society than before. And I think that's really causing a lot of this unrest and looking for a different answer.
Yeah. It seems to me that younger workers, and by that I mean those that are, relatively new to the workforce, have a very different outlook about work-life balance and how that impacts maybe their thinking about unionization. Do you think that as well? I mean, is that what's a part of what's happening?
Yeah, I do. Sometimes I wish I thought like they did. They value things that I probably didn't in my work life or didn't know I had the option to do. But when we think about what motivates this younger generation, I don't know if it's Z or X, I get a little bit confused, but they're different than where I came from. Things that are important to them are things like flexibility, when they're going to work, where they're going to work, what their work conditions are like. They're also looking for a sense of belonging, right? They want to belong to something. So if they don't feel like they're part of the organization, part of the enterprise, if they're not being heard, they're going to look for somewhere else to do that. And that has to do with diversity and safety at work. And they're also looking for internal mobility. Where am I going next? We know all this information about the gig economy and wanting to do different things and having that flexibility. So I absolutely believe if they're not getting that or they don't perceive to be getting that in the workplace, they're going to look for a way to get it otherwise. And that's where that kind of unionization, is a union the answer to that? The other thing about this generation is they don't really have a history with unions. They weren't around. My grandfather was in a union. In our generation, we were closer to it. So we had this vision of unions being mainly manufacturing, in the factories, working, and they don't have that perspective. So they're just saying, oh, it's a group of people. They're going to get us better benefits. They're going to help us work better together. They're going to drive that transparency that we want. If we come together, and in this group, we'll be able to get more of what we want from the employer. And that may or may not be true.
Yeah. You wonder how the traditional union sort of sees this new audience and goes, well, they want stuff out of us we've never done before also. We don't have
some of them are kind of going beyond that and finding non-traditional unions. They're forming their own unions, which I think is a challenge for employers who don't. Well, I think there's a lot of challenges for employers who don't understand kind of what that's going to look like at the bargaining table. Even the people coming to the bargaining table don't really know what to expect. I remember doing a union bargaining in my career. I did not work in a factory, but I was a leader of an organization that had unions. And at one point, I had one of our internal labor leader who dealt with all the bargaining come to me and say, Deb, I need someone from your team to help be the business representative on this bargaining that we were doing with a particular union. And I said to him, Tim, I said, I'm going to do it. And he said, no. He said, I need someone on your team. And I said, look, Tim, in my career, I've never done this before. This happens to be relatively local. I want to do it. Like, I really want to get this experience. And it was fascinating. It was one of the best things I've ever done in my career. He was a masterful learner. So I learned so much from him, but it was very much a script. It was very orchestrated, and one side knew what the other side was going to do. And I don't know if that's what's going to happen now, because we don't have that sort of history.
Yeah, it's interesting, really interesting. So now a little bit on the other side of this page, and I'm thinking of this generation in particular that we're talking about. How do employers take actions that will sort of discourage this talk about unionization from occurring?
Yeah. Well, I think you can't wait until you start to hear the rumblings of it happening. You're kind of too late. So I think you have to think about, what are you doing to really create the great work environment, the inclusive one where they feel they have flexibility and belonging and that you're listening to them. We often talk about employee relations, focusing on those moments that matter. And to us, those moments that matter are when things go wrong. Things are going to go wrong in the workplace, or things are unexpected. They're going to deviate sort of from the norm. And how does your employer respond to that? Is how you build trust with your employer. And I think that employers have to think about that now. They have to not wait for something bad to happen with an employee, but identify where they could go bad and then fix it, right? So, classic in what we do is, someone feels they're being harassed or they're not being treated properly. Typically, the employee has to come forward and alert the employer that that's going on. Employers need to do a better job of looking at the data, looking at the documentation and the insights to say, something's going on in this location. Gee, it kind of correlates to that new leader coming in. We're seeing a lot more discourse. We're seeing, look, what's going on with that leader? Maybe we need to proactively manage that instead of waiting until our employees either start leaving or start being discouraged by it. Putting their arms around their employees and putting them in a position where they can do their best work is going to build that trust. And when that happens, I believe employees are going to be less likely to look elsewhere. Thinking about what's important to employees. Flexibility is important to our employees. Okay, do we have to have them back in the office? And if we do, are we being transparent with them as to why? Are we making those decisions equitably? All of that goes a long way. Employees don't expect everything to go right at work. That would be unrealistic of them. But they want to know that when things don't go right, that the employer has their back and they're going to do things in a way that makes sense.
I did a little research and I read that in 2022, unions formed in really different places from the past, as you were mentioning, like Trader Joe's, Apple stores, Chipotle restaurants, Kaiser Permanente, Starbucks, even a group of graduate students at MIT, Amazon warehouses, and GM has a new battery plant they never had before for electric vehicles. And so those workers unionized also. These businesses are really diverse. You look at them and you go, there's no two of them the same exactly. But I wonder, what is it that they have in common that brings, unionization to their doorstep?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think that's one of the challenges, right? You're seeing these in non-typical unionized settings. So even beyond who the workers are, think about the employers and the human resource personnel, the managers who have probably never dealt with this before either. So that's another complexity because they haven't grown up in understanding sort of how do you manage their unions. But when I think about what they have in common, all those companies tend to have a much younger workforce, a lot of them retail. Some essential workers, not all, but if you think about it, those stores stayed open. So back to my earlier comment about the pandemic, lower wages, a lot of hourly workers, distributed locations, so smaller groups. They tend to also have diverse or more underrepresented employees there of a diverse population in those organizations. The other thing that strikes me when I hear you say those names of those companies is I think of those brands as those that really pride themselves on being more progressive. Apple, Trader Joe's, Chipotle, in how they manage their employees. So I think that's really interesting. And what it may just have kind of done is sort of raise the expectation for those employees because they're used to being said that they're going to be treated a different way. And so I think if you're going to be a brand that's promoting sort of being more progressive, then you need to pay attention to how you're living up to those standards.
Yeah. And it's not just about, the hourly wage, because many of those locations were, paying a good $15 an hour to most of their workers already. So it's not just the money. And I think that's one of the lessons here that these companies are struggling with a bit. Is it, it's kind of like I can hear the gears rolling in the managers' heads already going, well, we gave you a raise of $5 an hour. What's wrong? I think they're mystified by this.
Yeah, the other thing I think about, again, I'm just sort of thinking about these brands again, and when I think about them, I think about customer service as being sort of one of the tenets of their success, right?
Yep.
Trader Joe's, I love going to Trader Joe's. Why do I love it? Because they're always happy and they're jumping to help you and racing. Of course, the Apple stores, they're swarmed with employees sharing their knowledge about you. Chipotle, they make great burrito. So I wonder if just the worth, and by the way, also very successful companies that you've talked about right there.
Yep.
So, the sort of the understanding of these employees of their worth to that organization is beyond the hourly wage that they get. And they say, look, we're actually part of your success, and therefore we require more. We expect more from you.
I think, there's another factor in there too that maybe comes into this, is that all of these companies have difficulty keeping people. There's a lot of movement in the workforce, still is. It's slowed down a bit, but there's still a lot of movement. And I think employees seem to know, there's plenty of jobs. If I don't really like this one doesn't really do it for me, there's another one out there someplace. That's a change. I've talked to a few young people. They don't seem to have that. I'd really like to find one place and work my whole career there. That's not an idea for them. They have a feeling like, I'm going to work 20, 30 different places. That's okay. Right. And so it makes retention an issue.
Absolutely. How many times have you gone by a Starbucks and seen that they're closing at 2:00 because they cannot staff it? So there is that leverage that this type of worker has more than ever, and this is how they're going to use it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, keeping people. My illustration there is one of our favorite places to pick up dinner from on a Friday night happens to be a place called the Wooden Chicken. My grandson loves it's deep fried chicken and JoJo's, right?
Sounds good. I don't know what JoJo is, but it sounds good.
It's like a large French fry.
I'll take it.
It's like a potato wedge. Yeah. And we go on a Friday night and they're closed because they can't find a cook, right? That just seems like that issue in the workplace. I think the formula is all different, right? For this whole interest in unions. One of the things I read is that some of these companies that we just went through that list, they've mounted really forceful call them counter campaigns. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be kind of working. Most of the Amazon warehouses vote against unionizing. So did workers at Home Depot and at Trader Joe's location. And momentum has kind of slowed down. I think everybody heard about Starbucks, but that momentum has slowed down. In reality, there's about 270 unionized Starbucks stores, but that's only like 3% of their locations. When a reporter says companies, have mounted forceful opposition, what can they do, and what can they do that isn't legal, to do this? Because I would imagine that there's things that companies aren't allowed to do when it comes to unionization and trying to put a counteroffensive in place.
Right. They can't prevent them from having, bargaining or trying to come together and unionize, and they can't squash that. But they can share sort of what the benefits are and be really clear about what they can provide and what they are providing. And to my comments before, they should have been doing that all along. I also think what we're seeing happen, which, time will tell, is that some of these unions that organized and won their vote early on, when they've sat down to negotiate, they realize that maybe the grass is not always greener on the other side, and they really have more when they're not unionized, or they can more. So I think educating the workforce on the trade-offs is really important. I go back to what those three things we were talking about that this generation really values. And if we think about flexibility, sense of belonging, internal mobility, there is a great sense of personalization to that. And when you think about it, that personalization goes away when you're part of a union, right? It's sort of the antithesis of what this generation wants. I mean, they want to be individualized. They sort of want to be flexible in what their needs are. We talk about bringing your whole self to work, valuing diversity. And to a certain extent, that becomes handcuffed because you become part of a unit that sort of walks in step. The ways that you are differentiated is based upon how long you've stayed somewhere, which again, talk about people wanting to leave. And you do lose your voice. And so it may have seemed like, time will tell, that this looked like the good solution. The company's not listening to me. Here's a group that's listening to me. They're embracing me. They're getting behind us. But when they're actually have something in place and they sit down to the bargaining table, they may not be getting what they really need. And, you're essentially giving your voice to somebody else.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, because you're no longer sort of negotiating your raise. You're negotiating a raise for everybody.
That's right. And we're negotiating the flexibility that will work for everybody, which by definition, I don't think that's flexibility. That's sort of,
That's a schedule.
Yeah, that's a schedule. Exactly.
Yeah. And so interestingly enough there, if I'm the employer and I really start thinking about that deeply, there are probably times when that's a benefit because you can actually build into the negotiating and the bargaining, especially if you're old school, it's privately held type of a company and, you want to know what the schedule is and you want to know when people are going to be here and when they're not going to be here and all of those sorts of things. A union can actually help build that kind of structure. So,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, what's happening a little bit at Starbucks is, they went and started giving certain benefits to the non-unionized stores. And there was not can they do this? Well, yeah, because we have to bargain with you for your benefits, for your terms of employment. We can't just throw new things out to you. So, this is what you wanted. This is what you're going to get.
Yeah. I find it very, very interesting, this whole conversation, and thanks for your input. It's one of those topics that I'm sure as business owners see the landscape and they hear these news reports about unions forming in places like Starbucks and a lot of retail locations, granted, but a lot of young people get hired by a lot of companies in all sorts of walks of life. If you're a smart HR person, the takeaway I come away from this is companies need to be a lot more, you use the word transparent, but I think it's a lot of the benefits that people see in their company end up being like a list on a piece of paper. They need understanding because it's not just your wage, it's all the benefits and all of the flexibility and what is that already, right? Before I'm dissatisfied. Yeah,
absolutely. And again, that's a transparency. What does it mean? Why are you putting this plan in place? How is it going to impact me positively or negatively? And why does the company want to do it? And I think we're just seeing that with all organizations. The leaders that are willing to be more transparent with their employees are just going to build that better relationship. And that's how you build trust. And then when things go wrong, you have their back. And we're seeing that now with all the layoffs that we're seeing now. The companies who have that built up trust for years, it's not like right away because something's going wrong. You can't just ask for trust in the moment. You have to have earned it.
Yes. Yeah.
It's okay. I mean, we saw that last week, the week before, Salesforce did a rather large layoff. And if I were to go on LinkedIn, and I see a lot of people who were laid off because they tend to be in recruiting, and I'm connected to a lot of HR people because you let go recruiting teams if you're not hiring, and they're not saying bad things about their employer. They're actually saying really wonderful things about their time there, and they get it. And that just means that company has built the trust over the years. Stripe, another example, several months ago, they had a large layoff. Their CEO came and said, "We made a mistake. The leadership screwed up. We're accountable for this. And this is the result. We're sorry about it." As opposed to saying, well, the economic conditions, or maybe you didn't do your part. We have some other leaders in the past who've said, you guys aren't working hard enough. I won't mention those. That's building trust. And that's good. That's why those companies, will see a unionization.
It's very interesting, Deb. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's been a good conversation. And I'll be interested to see what kind of comments we get from our audience. So Thank you again. And thanks to everyone else. And we'll see you again on the next episode of the Connected Enterprise Podcast.